There's a certain uncertainty, and that uncertainty is that, again, we're facing a deadline of August 1st where we really don't know if President Trump is going to move forward with these tariff threats. First it was Liberation Day, then it was July 9th, now it's August 1st. But what we can say is, and this is what we're telling our clients, is that even though this process is going to continue to play out, a lot of it determines on the negotiations. So we're telling our clients, be very close to the news cycle, because if negotiations go well, you see further exemptions. If negotiations with other countries, for example, the European Union, we're hearing from Bloomberg News that there could potentially be some news around that. If negotiations don't go well, that's usually what brings forth these announcements for President Trump that these tariffs are going up exponentially 20, 30%. I would also just say that there's a little bit of difference, though, when it comes to Brazil and this idea of this 50% tariff on Brazil. It's not so much a policy question, it's more of a political question, because President Trump often, brings up former President Bolsonaro's, cases in Brazil for a reason for that tariff. So I would just say is the Brazil-U.S. relationship is a little bit different because of that question. But again, for most of our clients, they were preparing for July 9th. Now they have to prepare for August 1st and potentially even further beyond that.
Yeah, so now you can impose tariffs on another country or on their goods coming into this country, not just because of a deficit, but for political reasons.
Yeah, and that actually
we've crossed the Rubicon at some point.
Well, and that brings up an interesting point here, because let's talk about how President Trump is implementing this tariff. There are various different ways that presidents can implement tariffs. If you ever hear people in the news say Section 301 or Section 232, what they're talking about is an investigation by the U.S. Trade Representative or the Department of Commerce, and investigations take time. But what President Trump is using in this case is called AIPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Now, there has been court cases going against President Trump for usage of AIPA, and just amongst the analysts and chatter that we had this morning, our litigation analyst Holly Fromm isn't exactly sure that AIPA is one of those ways that President Trump could implement tariffs when you're using President Bolsonaro's cases as a reasoning here. So again, these court cases are going to continue to play out through the next few weeks and months. Nothing says that President Trump can't just change it from an AIPA tariff to a Section 301 tariff. But that brings time, that brings a process, and that gives some additional time for negotiation between those two countries.
Markets are generally just presuming that Trump's new rounds of letters is status quo, and there's the August 1 big deadline. What is stopping Trump from following through?
Well, nothing. Obviously, President Trump, there's lots of talk about, taco. Trump always takes chickens out. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was just telling individuals this week, I wouldn't exactly say that. I'm not sure I would actually buy that. Giving a warning to market participants that there potentially could be a time in which these tariffs move forward. But we will also say is that, we do not think the president wants to implement tariffs in a way that harms the U.S. consumers. For example, we saw this negotiation with Canada, the letter with Canada. USMCA goods are not impacted by that additional 10% tariff on goods from Canada. So as a result, the impact on U.S. consumers isn't going to be all that much. We've always taken the approach that, President Trump is going to try and continue these negotiations in a way that doesn't harm individual consumer spending, that you would see it like the Targets and the Home Depots and the Walmarts and so forth. For example, obviously there's a new tariff on tomatoes coming in from Mexico. That potentially could raise prices. So we do think that if you see prices change at the grocery stores and at the Walmarts and the Home Depots, that's when President Trump would ultimately say, maybe we should pull back, maybe we shouldn't move forward with this.
Put on your lawyer hat. Give me the update. We heard from the Court of International Trade in Lower Manhattan. Where do the court proceedings, where do they stand right now, the challenges?
Well, they're continuing. And the worst thing for market participants is that courts just don't they don't move very quickly. Obviously, President Trump can go out on Truth Social and he can change the narrative in the tariff debate. But then you have courts that actually were going to take time. Now, the Supreme Court eventually could get this case. Our analysts think that could happen as soon as this year. But, we're talking about something later this year. We're not talking about something where, the market participants want that certainty almost instantly. So even though you have these court cases going in the back of your mind, we actually have to deal with what President Trump will do in the interim and what he'll do in the short term. And that's why we consistently go back to this idea that there will be uncertainty up until August 1st. You will potentially see, if negotiations aren't going well, another heightened headline risk opportunity. But then ultimately we will see, I think, more of a status quo where the markets are going to be like, okay, we understand where President Trump's going with, but again, it's not really going to shock the system.